So I'm going to be doing a demonstration that I call L'Église sur Mer. It's mostly invented, as much my work. I always start with a quick pencil value study before I go on. It's kind of my roadmap. I really enjoy these. They precede every single painting. This was a lighthouse that's at the base of the Golden Gate Bridge. This is a painting I did about 10 years ago. And I just took it and decided to make a little French village out of it, with a little church there on the promontory. So I do this a lot. So regarding the materials, I'm going to be using Saunders Waterford 140-pound rough. It's a fantastic paper and a great alternative to Arches, which has its issues these days. Here's my palette. I'll be using cobalt blue, cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, Quinacridone burnt scarlet. Is there a problem? And these are the brushes that I'll be using. The Isabey for the large ones, but I'll be mostly doing most of this painting with the Silver Black Velvet number 12. It's a fantastic, fantastic brush. So let's get started. I've got my pencil work on the watercolor paper. You can see my board is slightly slanted. I'm left-handed, so I have everything on my left-hand side. So you can see my palette over there. And so the first step is an underpainting. It's a very light painting, and I use two colors, permanent orange and cobalt blue. So before getting started, I'll make a good sized puddle of each one. The reason I use these two colors is for a number of reasons. One is that I'll have all three primaries represented. So in the orange, I have the red and the yellow, and in the blue, I'll have the blue, so the three primaries. If you mix all three primaries together, you get kind of a gray, so that can be quite useful. But the other main reason, I think, is that I have a cool and a warm, and I play lots of games. I think actually color temperature is one of the unsung heroes of any kind of painting. And I use it a lot. So, but by having these two complementary colors, one cool, one warm, I can create a lot of visual excitement using just these two. So this is just for the underpainting. It'll all be maybe kind of a non-fat milk consistency, maybe 2%. And I'll be doing a graduated wash, you'll just see in a couple seconds, starting at the top and going down to the bottom. And we'll talk more about that as I start to do it. So I take the orange. See, I want this kind of sunset sky. And so I'm going to start with kind of the orange there in the sky and bring it all the way across. And what's really important if you've not done this kind of graduated wash is you see that bead of water that's forming at the base? You just keep that bead of water going down. So the other very critical part of this underpainting is that there's going to only be two areas that are completely white, and that's the front of this church here and the front of the little steeple behind it. Everything else is going to get painted over. And as you'll see later on, you'll find out that things are going to look white, but there'll be a warm white or a cool white. And part of with watercolor, you have to you can use opaque white, of course, but it's much more luminous if you can preserve the white of the paper as your white, which requires a fair amount of planning, and which is where my value sketch came in. So I'm sticking with the orange so far, and I want this kind of misty feeling around the church, which is one of the reasons I brought in just the pure clear water to make it kind of look like there's mist in the distance. And now I'm bringing in the cobalt blue and just kind of bringing it all the way across. There's actually going to be very, very little blue in this underpainting. I have a familial tremor, so don't worry about if my hand shakes. I've learned to use it, so especially if I've had too much coffee in the morning, which is true when I did this painting. And you just keep going down the page. And now I've painted around my whites. And you can see a little bit of the visual excitement of having the blue and the orange. and then over the rocks. But you can see, one thing people often do when they do these underpaintings, they start painting around things. And you get this kind of splotchy feel. What this also does, I think, is that it kind of ties the whole painting together. That there's a base of just these colors. And so I've done it both ways without it. And without it, it's kind of, it's a little choppy. So now I'm doing kind of the tops of the waves. So I'm kind of be a little freer here and kind of splotch out some of the paint just so it's a little more irregular here at the top of the waves. So this is, I have to admit, this is completely invented. The painting that it was based on is San Francisco Bay, which never has waves. So I like being able to invent things, and so and I really like painting waves. I'm actually a native Californian and grew up very close to the beach, so. And also it kind of creates a little more drama with this serene church on the rock. I mean, a lot of these paintings I feel like are short stories. And so I think it's really important to kind of build a story into a painting. And so this is kind of a very dramatic nature versus man versus nature kind of thing. I should say humans versus nature. And that's the underpainting. So after this point, I have to let it dry completely. This is about 15 minutes later. It's really important that your underpainting dry. And so now I'm going to paint the background. Coincidentally, it happens to be in the upper right corner. And since I'm left-handed, I actually always start in the upper left-hand corner and kind of move to the left so I don't put my hand in wet paint. I do lots of wet and wet, as you'll see. And if you put your hand in the wet paint, it has a tendency to mess up the wash. So I'm very careful about this. In fact, in many paintings, I just start in the upper left, and I go down. Once I reach the bottom, I'm done. So I paint very directly, and and one thing I also is kind of like fingernails on the chalkboard is putting my hand on the paper, which is, so my value study is quite handy to have there as well, so my hand doesn't go on the paper. So I'm going to just be mixing these two colors on the paper for the most part. You notice I have the two puddles. I do mix them a little bit on my palette, but I really want to have that excitement of the visual back and forth, orange and blue throughout. And so, you know, I started out as a plein air painter, so I'm used to painting very directly, which means I don't go back on top of things. When I get them to the level that I want, and then I just keep moving on. I don't glaze I mean, you can call the underpainting a glaze, I guess. But for the most part, I paint wet and wet and just go from right to left and up to down. So now I'm painting the mountain as well. And again, just kind of mixing these colors. You know, I'm trying to get ultimately what I'm trying to do here, in addition to color temperature games, is just get that value that I want, that I had in my value study. Because the thing is if you get the value right, you can put any color down that you want. And so I should also point out, even when I'm working from a photograph, I never work from a color photograph. I always paint them in black and white, which helps you see the values. And I prefer not to have a photograph determine what colors I want to put down. Is really, you know, there's a lot of people say, oh, values are more important, colors more important. They're both really important. But if you don't have the bones right, which are the values, it's really hard to make a painting, a representational painting, and be successful. So this is also maybe my 2% milk. And while it's still wet, and this is what I really love about watercolor, is just you can just kind of drop color in and mess things up a little bit and rough things up, but still just keeping those two colors. You know, the other thing you might notice is that I'm linking everything together. And in fact, if you want to follow this painting throughout, you'll see I'm constantly linking things together. And I think it's really important for the homogeneity of the painting if everything kind of ties together. The other compositional reason is that if you, they say, and there's lots of rules about composition, but one of them is that if you, the fewest number of shapes will make a stronger composition. There's lots of exceptions to this, but it's a good rule to keep in mind. And so by linking these all together, this is now one big shape, as opposed to there's the mountains and there's the buildings. They're all tied together. So I'm getting down here near where I want some more of the fog, so I'll be adding more pure water just to keep the illusion of the fog coming in. One of my guiding principles also is I try not to show everything. So one of the nice things about using mist and fog is that it allows the viewer to fill in the gaps, which I think is really, really important. And little drips happen. I mean, one thing about this process is that sometimes the paint does fly around. So if you see birds in one of my paintings, it's because there were too many splotches in the sky. As an architectural illustrator, I had to do incredibly precise work. And, so when I started doing my own painting, which happened more or less, actually that happened even before I started doing illustration, the last thing I wanted to do was a really precise painting. And one of the great things about watercolor is that if you let it just kind of flow by itself without even guiding it a whole lot, it's just beautiful. If you don't overwork it, if you don't go back in time after time after it dries and just let it go. I mean, unlike some of the opaque media, it's just naturally beauty. Adding more fog here. And it's just naturally beautiful. The colors are just gorgeous. And so I try not to overwork things too much, which is one of the reasons I put this down once and don't go back on top of it, just so it doesn't lose its luminosity, because that really is the key to great watercoloring, in my humble opinion, is just maintaining that sense of light coming through. So you can see quite a variety in value, not so much value, but color temperature by mixing on the paper. And so, of course, there are actually some mountains in that lighthouse painting, the Marin Headlands, but I thought this little village should have some mountains in the distance. So here we go. So one of the keys also for my compositional work is I always like to have, in landscape painting, I always like to have a foreground, middle ground, and background. And now while it's still wet, I'm going to indicate some little trees there on the hillside, so it's not just so flat. So this is my background. And one of the ways to create much more depth, because in reality, if I was going to use the Marin Headlands as an example, those
Michael?
Yes.
Can you restart your video and click optimize? Or
I did click it.
Okay.
I will start again. I'll stop the share.
Okay, I think it's just really fuzzy for some reason.
Okay, let's try.
Now you're not fuzzy, but your video is.
Okay, let me try again.
Yeah, thank you. We got a lot of comments on that.
Optimize screen share for video clip is on. It might just be my.
So you got optimize on and.
Yeah, it's on. Okay. Actually, share computer.
And you're playing at the highest settings.
Yeah, it's all. Well, I only had one setting here.
Okay. All right. All we can do is the best.
Okay, so we're going to start over again. Maybe we want to come back, or should I just maintain where we are? Hello? it'll get, I'm not quite sure what you're seeing, but that's all on. Trying to figure out if there's a, one thing I really tried to do in making this video was really just zoom in on my brush on the paper. So I think sometimes the camera was focusing on me. From my end, it was pretty sharp. I don't know what you're saying. If you would like me, do you want me to start over again? Are you okay?
Yeah, you're okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. And there's a little more, a few more trees. I've been told that most people don't paint like this. My influence, actually, I took 2 workshops in my life. One was with Jean Dobie when I was first learning how to watercolor, and she taught me glazing, and I glazed for quite a while. Then I took a workshop with Charles Reed, actually in Key West. And when I finished the workshop, I thought, well, yeah, it was fun, but I'm not sure I really learned much here. About 6 months later, it was like, oh, I get it now. And so a lot of this very direct way that I paint, it comes from him. So I'm now, the background's done, and I'm now moving on to painting the buildings. And so I have shifted from using the cobalt to using ultramarine blue and using quinacridone burnt orange and a little bit of quinacridone burnt scarlet. I don't have the earth tones. I use the quinacridones as my version of burnt sienna. And I'm now switching to the ultramarine because it has a darker value range than the cobalt does. Yeah, this does look very fuzzy, and I think it's because, yeah, when my head's in, I think it's focusing on my head, and then it gets sharper again. Well, anyway, again, I'll be doing much as I did in the back, same thing as I did in the background, mixing the colors on the paper. It's just that these 2 colors, as opposed to the cobalt blue and the permanent orange, have a greater value range and can become darker. So I am now going to be using those for much of the architectural part of the painting, even the rocks. But you can also notice here, I'm keeping that bead going all the way, you know, and this is where you have to have your paper at an angle. Otherwise, it just kind of puddles. And I know some people who paint that way. I find it much easier to paint on the angle, though. Actually, I normally have my paper at a much steeper angle than this. You know, for the graduated wash we saw earlier, the easiest way to keep that really smooth is to have your paper really slanted, so it doesn't puddle. You might also notice now and then, and maybe you can't see me doing it, but I'm constantly looking at my value study. And like, well, my value study really has all of the answers. And again, I will try to get the value that I want, and then I will just keep on moving down the page. But this way that I kind of use my brush to drop things in is something that I really did get from Charles Reed. After a bit, I was painting this, and then I thought, you know, I don't really need that white area. I'm going to just get rid of it. So I thought it was kind of confusing and didn't add much. So I can make those decisions sometimes. But I usually follow my, you know, here's the deal. I usually follow my value study fairly faithfully. But I also just try to make sure that I let the watercolor do its own thing and not try to control it too much. I mean, obviously you have to control it around areas and preserve things that are white. But within the washes themselves, in fact, I'll even sometimes try to create accidents. And, you know, sometimes when you do these things, people say, wow, you know, how did you do that? And I'll say, oh, you know, I'm just an expert, but it was all an accident. So I try to build in the so-called happy accidents. Again, trying to let watercolor just do its thing. Of course, just the opposite sometimes happens. You think you really got this wash all worked out, and then it doesn't do its thing, but it's just a piece of paper. But I really try to build it in and let watercolor do most of the work. Now adding a little bit of the Quinacridone burnt scarlet, which you can see the slightly purplish, grayish purple tone it is. These Quinacridone colors, if you're not familiar with them, all my paints are Daniel Smith, actually with the exception of the ultramarine blue, which is Holbein. But Daniel Smith has these great Quinacridones, and Quinacridones were actually invented in the 50s as car paint. You know, if you go back and look at some late 50s, early 60s cars, you'll see Quinacridone burnt scarlet as a trim color. So it's one of my favorites. In fact, my car is actually mostly that color, coincidentally. One of my students once pointed out. So, and again, I'm just trying to make sure, because, you know, watercolor dries so much lighter than when you put it down. I'm really constantly, even looking back up there in the right-hand corner, trying to decide, is that going to dry right? Because I've learned not to go back on top, except for maybe adding windows, which is what we'll do here. So you might notice I just be painting over the windows. Now I'm going to go into the rocks. Again, it's not like here's the building and here's the rocks. They're all going to be kind of linked together. And that bead at the bottom of the building, I'm going to keep my eye on the entire time because I want it to stay there so I can go right back into it. Yeah, I love the Quinacridone burnt scarlet, especially this little highlight. You know, here's an example. When I dropped that in over there on the rock, that reddish thing, I thought, oh, that's nice. I'll just leave it. And so this is the part that's not totally planned. It's things that I build in as I'm painting. But because I've got a good value study, I know if I just hit those values right, it doesn't matter if well, it does matter what I do with the color, but it's not as important for the success of the painting. So I'm going a little bit darker, a little heavier. So, you know, now I'm probably in the whole milk, and in some of the real darks, you'll see it'll be like yogurt. I'm using the water that's already in the paper. In fact, if you can see what I'm doing right now, I'm not adding any water into my brush. I'm not cleaning it off. I'm just going directly into the colors so that I don't add more water. One thing about these black velvets is that they're half squirrel hair and half hybrid. Synthetic rather, they're a hybrid. And they do hold a lot of water. And I've been using this now for about 2.5 years. And I'm a convert, and I used to be a sable snob, but if someone had told me that this was a sable, I would have believed them. It behaved, to me, it behaves just like a sable, and at a fraction of the cost, much to my wife is much more pleased about this, but as an illustrator, I would go through sable brushes every 6 months. Which got a little pricey. But this one really behaves well. It does hold lots of water though, so you have to make sure that you're getting the thickness of the paint down, which is the only way you can make darks, right? And so I'm doing the tops of the waves here. So you see some of my brush flicking here just to create things. Yeah. Here's some of the little bit of the experimentation I got with my rag, just to create a feeling of mist. Yeah. So the thing about a brush is that it also reminds me, one thing about watercolor painting as opposed to other kind of watercolor media, if you notice, my brush is barely touching the paper. It's really kind of floating along and kind of guiding the paint, as opposed to slurping it on as you would with an oil painting or acrylic painting. So really kind of a gliding dance, is the way I think of it. And again, this is one of the ways to make the paper, the paint really just go down beautifully. And so while it's still wet here, I'm dropping in close to yogurt. Maybe it's, well, definitely beyond 1/2 milk now. Just trying to create some variation in the rock. And all the while, I'm still looking at that bead up there, making sure that it's not drawing too much, so I can go right back into that building and bring this down. Yeah, and there we go. Not too bad. I didn't really want to have a line up there. And so these are actually some rocks that kind of go up against the building. So they were intended to be kind of a little rough. So I now feel that the rocks are, this section of rocks is done. I will not touch them again. So pretty happy with the value. I mean, the thing is that I wish the building were slightly darker than I made it, but I'm not gonna. I've learned the hard way not to go back in unless I absolutely have to. And I realize for a lot of people, I've been doing this a long time, so I can do this kind of thing, and it takes some getting used to. But the rewards are really worthwhile. And this really does come out of painting plein air, where you just don't want to spend a whole lot of time out there. The light changes. So for me, if I'm painting plein air, and even in my studio, I try to get things mostly done within an hour or so, sometimes an hour and a half. And this is where also the value study is so critical. So the other thing about the light here is that this painting is mostly backlit. The light is coming very, very strongly from the left-hand side. And when you do things that are backlit, it allows just the structures of the buildings or the forms of the buildings to tell the story. And so it's a lighting technique that I often use a lot, especially if the profile of the building is very interesting. The other thing that maybe is worth considering when you're painting is really try to ignore a little bit what the actual subject is and just paint the shade and shadow pattern that you've created. And the other stuff just kind of fits in. It was mentioned earlier in one of the talks about one of the demonstrations about the importance of shade and shadow. And I think it's particularly true in architectural subjects. You really can just define a structure, a building, just with shade and shadow. And so in effect, what I'm doing at this stage is I am just painting the shade and the shadow pattern. When it's dry, I will go back in on the areas you can see with the underpainting, those things those buildings looked like they were orange. Well, now they look white, kind of a warm white. So I will go back after I've done all the shade and shadow, and then just kind of indicate what I think of as dessert. Just a little bit of color on those light areas, on those whites buildings, because they shouldn't be that white. The roofs I will be doing at the very end. So if you're beginning to worry, well, the roof shouldn't be white, they're coming. So this is beginning to look pretty good to me. So I'm pretty happy at this stage. Let's just keep on going with the rocks. Now, I really do believe that if you let watercolor be watercolor and not overwork it too much, it's really important. So let me talk a little bit more about my value study and the decisions I make when I'm doing it. The first question I always ask myself is, what's my focal point? And the focal point is where you have your greatest value contrast. And we can't see the right now, but it's actually on the left-hand side, the church face with the black rock against it. That's going to be the one spot in the entire painting where I have the black against the white. And then I ask myself, do I have a foreground, a middle ground, and background? And I often have to create a foreground or do something strange with the background. But it goes back to before the Renaissance. They figured it out that those three planes really create a lot of depth into a painting. And so, and then I ask myself, there's actually the basic three questions. One, is there something different happening on all four corners? It's a very subtle thing, but it's one way to make your paintings more dynamic. I mean, if you want a really calm painting, make all your corners the same. But if you want a certain bit of dynamism, making all four corners different, actually, it's subtle, but it's really, test it sometime. You'll see that it's really effective. So those are the three basic questions I ask. And then just generally, do I like the composition, the arrangement of the forms? And I go from there. In fact, when I'm doing these, I often crop out lots of areas that when I'm looking at it, thinking, I don't need this, I don't need that, I don't need this, and I just crop it out. So I find that value studies, in fact, they're the most enjoyable part of the painting for me, is doing the studies. Where most of the decisions are made. And here I can just play around with the color and have a good time. Yeah, because ultimately, maybe I said ultimately, doing waves again, tops of the waves. Ultimately, for most people, I think, if you're not enjoying this, not having fun doing it, it's going to show. In fact, you can see paintings of mine that not as successful, and they look kind of labored. It's probably because I wasn't having fun. And so, and watercolor can be challenging to have fun with sometimes. So I'm going to paint the underside of the bridge. You might also notice I have a couple little people there on the bridge that I will be getting to shortly. But look how everything's linked together. I'm linking all of these things side by side. Now we got our bridge here. If people have seen my book, they know my story, that when I first started watercolor, I took a college course. I had no art training at all, and we did oil 1 week, acrylic 1 week, and watercolor another week. And this was in Southern California in the August, and there was no humidity. I had cheap brushes, cheap paper, and it was a total disaster. And I was totally traumatized because most things in art-wise always came kind of easy for me. And it was like I met my master. I had no idea what I was doing. The teacher was also not a watercolorist, which didn't help. I had no idea what I was doing. And I was so traumatized that I didn't touch a watercolor again for 10 years. I just admired it. Whenever I saw it, I was always impressed, but I was just really scared of it. So I really understand people when I teach who get a little frustrated and things don't go quite the way they want them to. And because I went through it myself. And I still, even to this day, whenever you think you've mastered watercolor, it'll come back and remind you who's really boss. But I feel much more comfortable with it today than I did then, that's for sure. All right, let's move back onto the building here while things are still kind of wet over there. Again, just painting the shadows. And you also might notice here just how light the background is. When I was first painting, it's hard to judge when you're painting against white paper, whether or not things are dark enough. And yeah, that could perhaps have been a little bit darker, but I often exaggerate the lightness of a background so that the middle ground jumps forward and does not compete with really what the story is all about. It's just kind of helping to add to the story. I do think of these paintings as short stories, in that in a short story you don't have room for lots of subplots, and you've got to have one basic plot and stick to it. And so these paintings really are just the short story. I don't want the background would be a whole other story and would complicate the plot. And so, but it's important to have it because it adds to the story, but to really play it down so that the main story jumps forward. Okay, see everything's linked together. When I was painting this, it was actually a fairly humid, foggy morning, which is really my favorite time to paint. Watercolor goes down much more easily or readily when there's moisture in the air, and which is one of the reasons I say that there's a reason that the British do watercolors and the Navajos did sand paintings. You can't do this in 20% humidity. I'm a bit of a nerd about this kind of thing. Actually, I have a hygrometer next to my desk, and once it gets below 60%, I kind of just, okay, maybe it's time to stop. Start again tomorrow. And here in California, it can get really dry sometimes. Yeah, excuse the bumps. I was using my lightweight traveling easel for this, and it did move around a little bit. I've actually made a few videos since then, and I put it on my more sturdy permanent palette, easel rather. So I'm still also looking back while I'm doing this at the rocks on the right-hand side, and is there anything else I can do? That's what I'm going back in, just trying to tighten things up a little bit because once they're dry, it just doesn't work. All right, let's go back down into the rocks. You might also notice that little piece of light that I have going underneath the bridge. If the light's coming from behind us slightly, it's actually casting light on the rocks, which I'll then paint those later. Now you can see it real clearly, that little patch of light coming in. It's also a little bit of an arrow pointing your eye through. I don't want to get too much into the kind of thing, but I really do think a lot about how the eye moves through the painting. And when I design these, I will often put in secondary focal points and tertiary focal points. I'll put in eye paths for the eye to go into the painting, to lead the eye into the painting. I play lots of, I think they're really not games, but they're interesting to do. I really like painting the tops of the waves. It's a lot of fun. I can just get my brush out there and just kind of wiggle it away. So. Well, I'm really glad this is has worked out, and I hope everyone can see this, because I mean, I've done lots of live videos and live demonstrations, and it's a shame that we're not all together and being able to do this live, but it's pretty phenomenal actually that you all can see me do this from the comfort of your own backyard or living room, wherever you are. So with Windows, well, I'll talk more about Windows later on, but as another little compositional rule, you try to avoid having fixed geometrical shapes in your painting unless you can't avoid it. And many paintings I've seen get ruined because people paint the windows so faithfully. I prefer to just suggest them and not make big rectangles. I'll be adding windows here later on, and you can see better what I'm talking about. But that front window, it's just not a big rectangle, and so I really try to be mindful of that. And it's a problem that often happens with windows. Yeah, while this is still wet, now it's time to add the darks. So that rock there on the far left, in front of the face of the building, that rock is my focal point. I don't have that black yet next to it, and it is also the only white in the painting, except for the upper little steeple. So it will be the one point where your eye lands when you're looking at the painting. Every traditional landscape painting has a focal point. Next time you're in a museum, when they reopen, a game I sometimes play with, or ask students to do, is to go through and identify the focal point. And once you've seen them a few times, you realize everyone used them. And I think part of what it is, if you're in a show and there's lots of paintings, this is kind of a hook to let the viewer have a place to land when they're looking at the painting. I mean, there's also some compositional, organizational aspects to it, but part of it is just the hook that allows the eye to go to that one spot. So I'm working on my focal point right now. And at this stage, I'm doing at tops of the waves, but just before this, I was just using almost pure pigment without adding hardly any water at all.
Hey, Michael, how did you secure your paper to the board, and how do you keep it from rippling when it's so wet?
Well, that's a good question. For 30 years as an illustrator, I sketched my paper. Mm-hmm. And then someone said, for most of these paintings, because this is like a half sheet, you can just tape them down with masking tape and you don't have to stretch them. And so I experimented with it, and sure enough, this is just, I used to use grafting tape, which is no longer made because people don't graft anymore. And it was it didn't stick a lot. And so I had to find a new tape. This is just from my Ace Hardware, their professional painter's tape I finally decided on. And so it is just taped down. And the thing about it is that there probably are ripples here that we can't really see. In fact, I think when I was doing my underpainting, I saw some. But I think it's mainly I'm painting smaller areas. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I don't see much rippling. But I do usually. I won't do it with this demo.
Well, I missed, what weight was the paper?
This is
140?
I'm 140. Yeah.
140. And that was Waterford, right?
Yeah. This is true with any paper, though. This is Saunders Waterford Rough.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I wasted so much time. And one difference, though, is that the sizing is still in the paper, so it does behave a little bit differently when you stretch it, like get it all wet. Some of the sizing comes off, so it does behave a little bit differently. But we.
If I remember right, it's sized a little heavier than Arches, isn't it?
Well, do I really want to get into this?
Okay.
I'm starting the water. No, this is an important point, and I won't belabor it. But Arches is the quality, and I'm going to get sued, I know, but the quality of Arches, this has been going on for years. It has gone really downhill. They moved their production to China, and it's now been bought by another company, and they've moved it back to Europe. Some of it's good, but some of it's really bad. I've had students just totally frustrated, and in fact, that's why I switched to Saunders, because of this. But what I've learned, though, is that the sizing is so important. It's really without sizing, if you put the water down on this, it would just soak in. So the sizing is what allows the watercolor to flow. And I was talking to a rep for Canson who had bought Arches, and he said, I think we fixed the sizing problem to me. Well, totally so they've had sizing issues. So, but what I've been told, though, is that if you do stretch it, it's usable because it washes off a lot of the sizing. So if you've got some around, I would just suggest that you stretch it. But with the Saunders, I have no problem with that. I chose Saunders mostly after testing a bunch of papers, and it was the way, to me, Arches used to be. So yeah, it's really too bad, because I was a total Arches aficionado for many years. Yeah. And but they took the production out of France, and I was having dinner with the president at Daniel Smith, and they used to do art supplies, so he knew all about this. And he said, making watercolor paper is a real art, and you just can't just use a formula. There's more to it than that.
You're doing this all originally starting wet on dry, right?
This is all wet on dry. Yeah. I should point out now that I'm actually using cerulean blue a lot here in the water. But otherwise it's the same colors that we get.
Now, all of your colors are granulating, aren't they? Except for the except for the burnt Scarlet. Yeah,
technically they don't granulate. But one reason I like the rough is that it kind of breaks apart and kind of shows the particles a little bit better. It's something I know some painters who hate that, but I think it really adds a lot of character. Too. Yeah, it adds a lot of character.
We've had some people ask if you would reiterate again the brushes you were using. You had two silver.
Yeah, sure.
Black velvet brushes, a 12 and 16. What was the other one?
Just the Isabey.
Yeah.
Which I used only for the underpainting. And when I was doing the background, I used the number 16, but for the rest of the painting here, I just used the 12. The thing about these brushes is that they hold their point really well.
I'm very fond of them too.
This brush that I'm using right now, I've been using almost constantly for 1.5 years, and it still has this incredible point.
Maybe squirrels are tough little boogers.
Well, I think it's the synthetic part of it that it really helps hold the point. I don't know what they did. I actually wrote them a letter. They're actually in New Jersey, and just told them how impressed I am by these brushes, because I have tried many, many brushes. I mean, Escoda actually makes some really wonderful brushes too, but I think these, because how I judge a brush is, there's a lot of things involved. One is, how long does it hold its point? Because once, for me, the way I paint, once it loses its point, I lose a lot. I mean, let me just also point out a little bit here while I'm doing this here at the end, is that I really want that sense of light coming from the left-hand side. So I go from the light on the left down to the water, down to getting a little bit darker as we get closer to the right-hand side. I also mentioned earlier how I try to have 4 different things happening in 4 different corners. This is another reason why I'm doing it as well. So I've now let the water dry a little bit, so I can go back on, and we're going to start putting in some of the final little details while it's dry. You know, the thing about windows, actually an architectural illustration is always a little bit of a joke. You know, people say, do you do windows? And I say, yeah, sure. But you can see that I'm not making little rectangles. I'm just trying to do a suggestion that there's some, and this is the background too, so it's not nearly as important. It's just the final little things on the background village. And then I go back in and I'm going to start adding just a little bit of orange on the roof. So from this point on, I'm going to be doing the windows and the orange, painting the light. And one thing I like about the orange is that it really kind of, you might notice, I might have noticed I don't have yellow on my palette because I found I just wasn't using it very much. But this orange helps to kind of provide that late afternoon golden light. And this is what I'm going to do on the front of this face as well. Just add a little bit of the orange to it, just so that it, right now it's just a little too white.
Michael, you said you spent about an hour on the paintings. Your value studies look like they might be more involved than that. How long do you normally spend on a value study?
I have spent hours on value. I have a stack of value studies that I can usually tell if painting is going to work or not. If I'm painting plein air, they take about 10 minutes. They're really fast and sketchy just because I'm outside. If I'm in my studio, I can just spend hours and hours just doing these things. Typically, though, they take about 15 minutes. This one took about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Yeah, you know, one thing about doing illustration is I learned to be fast. And I really don't like it when people say, oh, this painting only took me an hour, you know, some kind of macho thing. But because paintings, it doesn't matter however you reach the final result. If it's fast or slow, doesn't really matter. I've just learned to paint quickly because of having been an illustrator, I think. So you can say, so I'm going to just kind of suggest these windows just with some, I've mixed some black. I make my black with the ultramarine blue and the quinacridone burnt orange. Again, if you mix all 3 primaries together, you get a gray. And if you do it really thickly like this, it's how you get a black. So in architectural subjects, it's usually how I make my black. And so I'm just hinting at these windows. And then, you know, close up, you know, sometimes they, they don't look so good. But from distance, they work well. And I really don't want to belabor them.
What was the orange used again? Primary orange or what?
Permanent orange.
Oh, permanent orange.
Yeah,
Okay.
I used to use cadmium orange, and I don't know, someone scared me about how toxic it is, and so I took it off my palette and replaced all my cadmiums. It was actually Charles Reed who convinced me to use cadmiums originally, and so this works pretty well. I use the organic vermilion as my cadmium red. So, but cadmium orange I still love. There just isn't anything else quite like it. I still save tubes for special occasions, but the permanent orange works pretty well.
Okay.
It does have a large drying value shift, so it does dry much lighter than you think it is when you first put it down. But that just takes some getting used to. So you can see a little bit now that I've done that orange on that roof over there, how the light really starts to turn on and the visual excitement happens because of the orange.
Someone has asked if you could shift to the other side of the painting, Michael, so they could see the value, the focal point in your background painting.
I can't shift it. This is all recorded.
No, on the your live's presentation.
I'm sorry, say this again?
The on-screen, your live presentation,
right.
You have a virtual background of the painting you're doing. And someone asked if you kind of move over a little so they could see the focal point.
Oh, I didn't realize that you guys could still see. Oh, where I'm standing. No, here.
Move just a little bit.
Is that what you're talking about? Oh, is that what you're talking about? Okay.
Yeah, but the other way. You just went off screen.
Let's see if I can go the other way. There we go.
Yeah,
How about that?
that's perfect.
How about there? How about there?
That way they can see the focal point you're painting on right now.
Right. Got it.
Well, you're back to the bridge, but yeah.
Oh, I'd forgotten
Thank you.
I'd forgotten that was still visible up there. So. All right, a few more windows and oranges, and I think we're done. So. I'm doing little scallops there at the edge of the roof. You know, one thing I've learned too is that it's really easy to, the one more thing, as many people know, it's really easy to overwork these things. And so I'm usually someone who, when in doubt, I just stop and I put my brush down, and it's not unusual for me to think it's the worst thing I've ever done in my entire life. And I think, oh, I really screwed it up. And I've learned to go down, have a cup of tea or something, and then go back and look at it and then decide.
Oh, so we're not alone in that respect.
Yeah. Well, I think, I have an image in my head that I'm trying to, even though I don't have a photograph, that I'm trying to achieve. And rarely goes exactly the way I planned it. And I always see, oh, I could have done something over there. I could have made that a little bit darker. But I've learned just to let it go. And it's kind of a Zen thing a little bit, I guess, but it's what it is. And many times I think it's the worst thing in fact, the painting you mentioned that won the award at the American Watercolor Society, I was so disappointed with it that I didn't put it on Facebook. I didn't show it to anyone for like 2 weeks. Yeah, I thought it was the worst thing I'd ever done. And I'm not joking. I was so disappointed with it because it didn't meet what I had in mind. And then I put it on Facebook and people really liked it. And I looked at it again and thought, well, maybe it's okay. The counterpoint to that is you think you really nailed something, and then you look at it a few days later and thought, oh my God, this is awful. So, sometimes you think the children are ready to go, but, sometimes they're not. And it's hard to judge your own paintings. Because I have an image in my head and I'm trying to achieve, and it doesn't always, when you paint this way and let the watercolor kind of do its thing, things are going to happen. And I've learned to kind of live with it. Yeah, I think that's about it, as I recall. Because I think, oh, those rocks could have been a little bit darker or something like that, but I just kind of, yeah, see here.
One thing I don't think you mentioned is the brands of paints that you might use.
Yeah, I'll do it. They're all Daniel Smith, except for the ultramarine blue, which is Holbein. Everything else is Daniel Smith.
Okay.
And I think, looking at it now, we're about done.